And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Benched with Bubba, episode 608. The 2023 season's over for those that have kept track at home. So we are still recapping 2023, always looking forward to 2024. But before we dig in too far into 2024, it's fun to talk about the good things that took place in 2023. And one of the really good things is winning an overall championship in the NFBC. You know, we like to just win leagues once in a while. But to win an overall for $150,000, that's pretty cool stuff. Just going to throw it out there. So I have a special guest joining me today. He's been making the rounds. I've had the pleasure of interacting with him on Twitter and in the YouTube chats for a couple of years now. He's a really, really good fantasy player. You can find him on Twitter at @Fru_Dorte. Drew Forte. How you doing, my friend?
Hey, Bubba. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I've been a listener for a few years now. I appreciate all the content. You're one of the hardest workers out there. You're putting out content every day. The First Pitch podcast, Bench with Bubba and the Bloom. So I love the work you've been doing, and I'm happy to be on and happy to talk about the fantasy baseball season that was and, what we may think happened in 2024.
Definitely, I'm looking forward. First off, thanks for the kind words. Actually, thank you. But we will definitely have some fun with this because you've. I remember a couple of years ago you were like hitting me up with questions or doing this and that because you started listening to the show and then all of a sudden I see this year there's this name towards the top of the leaderboards and overalls. I'm like, what? And then next thing you know, he's winning the whole thing and he's on podcast. I'm like, well, I gotta send a message. Like, we got to get this guy on the show. So I'm looking forward to it. But for those that don't know, let's just have a little background before we dig into the success that was 2023. And let's just go to the simple questions. How long have you been playing fantasy baseball for? Because it's fun. Like you talk to the Phil Dussaults. Oh, I just started playing like 4 years ago and I win the whole thing. And then there's guys that have been playing since they were like in high school. So how long have you been playing fantasy baseball?
I've been playing fantasy baseball since 2006. I was a teenager back then. Since 2006, it started a Yahoo head-to-head league. I still play in that league. It's adapted a little bit. It started as an 8-team league. Now it's up to a 12-team league. But been playing since 2006. Then I migrated over to a league I played with Rob DiPietro. I was on a podcast with him back in the middle of the season. If you want to hear it, that league had some crazy rules. So into that league, I had another home league that I still run. It's an auction keeper league, which is a lot of fun. And then I started migrating over to playing also in the NFBC in 2019. And I've been playing in the online championship since 2021. And I love it. I love all things fantasy baseball and baseball in general.
Third year in the OC and you take it down. That's pretty good. Like, this was my second year and I was happy just almost winning a league and I got hosed into third place on like the last day. That was just went from like first to third in a week. That was devastating, but this is not about me today. This is about you. So it is a totally different format that takes some learning. So the fact that you nailed this in the first three years is good. Like, we were messaging like the guilds, for instance, and I've had him on. He's an amazing fantasy player, and he does well on the 12 teams. Like, he's got a science, and he was mad with the 17th overall this year because he's been top 5 for 3 straight. He won it all last year. So he's kind of got this like rhythm to it. The fact you figured out your rhythm for them, like you had what, 2 top 10 teams, right?
Yeah, I think the second team faltered a little bit the last week. It fell to 13th overall.
That's okay, but still, that's pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Pretty darn good. So, in your third season, you had 2 top 13 OC teams, which is pretty darn impressive. I'm just going to use the term OC for people listening. If you're curious, that is 12-team online championship fab leagues on NFBC. I know sometimes we like to cater to all formats. This is going to be primarily an NFBC show. 12-team format, which is impressive. I would imagine that's your preferred format now, but I'll ask anyways because you said you played head-to-head with your home league forever, and there's always a spot in our hearts for our home leagues, no matter where you play and how you play it. And I'm the one I think you're talking about with Rob. I've heard him talk about that many times. It's a bizarro league at times. Yeah. But what is your preferred format?
Yeah, I really enjoy the 12-team mixed format, and the reason I like it is one, that's what I grew up playing, what I still play. So there's a comfortability with it. There's, I'm used to it. And what I enjoy about the 12-team format is there's a good balance between the draft and fab. And you need a good draft to succeed and to do well, but you also need to do well in fab because there's those impact players every week. And Bubba, when you're playing these online championships, every week there's a guy to add a quality talent. And so I enjoy both parts of those, that it's equally a weighted draft and fab in terms of success.
Yeah, that's what I talk about it a lot, because I'll have my guess like Curlin's a 15-team guy, Toby was a 15-team guy primarily till this year. He like crushes a 750 OC, but like I like my 12s for that reason. It's like I always say, well, fantasy's supposed to be fun. You're in a 15, like some weeks in fab, that just isn't fun. That's just miserable. We're like in a 12, as you said, there's always a handful of at least people you can look at on waiver wire and go, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I can put some money on them, or some like major impact guys, like you said, especially this year with all the call-ups we had. There was a ton of them. And I do want to get into your fab philosophy in 12s eventually, because that is just bizarro world, and I know you know exactly what I mean. But yeah, the 12s I just enjoy because it's like 10s it's almost too shallow at times, because it's just everyone's got an all-star team and it's just whatever you want it to be. But that 12 kind of gives you that balance, that you can draft a great team, like you said. But if you have an injury or a guy that doesn't perform, like we'll talk about your team, there's guys that stood out to me like, man, you probably dropped them quick, and that's just the way it works. But you had options, which is great to consider. Where in a 15, you could be dead in a month. Like if you just have like 3 injuries, you're just done. There's just like no hope, and that can be frustrating. So you said you started the NFBC in 2019, year before the pandemic. So you got at least one full season kind of before the weird stuff, and let's build back up to where we're at now. What got you to come over to the OC? Was it just word of mouth? Was it you were ready to up the competition, quote unquote? Because that's always something that like listeners and stuff go, well, I don't want to pay that money. We tell them what satellites, and there's other ways to get into it and get the feel. What got you to come over to OCs or to NFBC?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I started playing in this crazy league, and the reason it's crazy is because it used teams from the AL and NL, but not all of the teams. So it was always awkward. So I found RotoWire in about 2018, and their draft software was helpful for that, for picking different teams. And I started listening to the podcast, and I would hear Jeff and Scott talk about on every Sunday night the main event, the online championship, who's winning, who they were adding. And I was like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. It's something I should check out. And so I went in, and, like everybody who starts in the NFBC, you try to start small. In my first year, I played in one satellite league, and I didn't do very well because there's a learning curve. And I think a lot of things with fantasy baseball, from new leagues to new tools, there's a learning curve. You're never going to get it right away. And I struggled. 2020, I always had goals to build up every year. After 2019, I said, okay, I want to get into more leagues, get into an online championship. 2020 came around, and I actually only played in one NFBC league that I had drafted. It was a NFBC 50 league, which I ended up winning. I think I tied, but I actually didn't draft any other NFBC leagues because I was so new that I didn't want the shortened season of 2020 to impact my thinking or my decision making. So I wanted to go back and fresh with 2021, not being thrown off by a short season. That was actually really beneficial. So I played in my first online championship in 2021, and I won. It was a beat Todd Zola league. And I drafted well. And I think I drafted well because I wasn't influenced by what happened in 2020 in terms of short fab, and you only have 60 games to make up points. And I was able to put together a pretty good strategy to have success there. And then 2022, I played in 2 online championships, and I refined my process. I actually didn't do that well last year. And I think that was a big driver of the success I had this year, because I finished 3rd in both of those online championship leagues. And if you're not familiar, the online championship only pays out the top 2 spots.
Very familiar right now. Yep.
Yeah. And both of those, I was in contention to win or come in second the last week. One of them, I would have finished second. I streamed Davis Martin, and we're going to get into fab. I got my 10th conditional bid that last year, and I was stuck with him, and he got blown up, and that cost me. And so I looked back, and we can get into this. I looked back at what I did right, but more importantly, what I didn't do well last year. And I really brought that to this year of, here's my mistakes. Here's where I think I can get better. Here's how I'm going to get better. And then it was just about executing it. And I think if I didn't have that failure last year, I'm not sure that I would have had the success that I had this year. So I think that's important for, no one likes to lose and no one doesn't like to do well, regardless if you're playing NFBC or Yahoo, ESPN, whatever league you're playing in. You look back, take the time now, look back if you didn't have the season that you wanted to have, if you didn't reach those goals, and figure out what went wrong, what the teams that did do well, what did they do well that you didn't do well, and how can you apply that to next year?
I think that's great. And that's one thing is, you mentioned before the show, you were talking about how like you don't have like an algorithm or all these things, just about like hard work and putting the time in to research what, or looking at what other people are researching and write, whatever, all that kind of stuff. But the thing I get out of that is hard work. And that's just the bottom line of anything in life. Like certain people are smart enough to have a formula that prints things out, but the hard work made that formula. So that's just kind of how you got to go about it. So I want to go back to something you mentioned there is, I love the idea of, okay, yeah, we can all enjoy like our fun. It's like Bloomfield and I on the last episode, we had fun. Like, hey, we won. Let's have fun. It's been a long season. But then we also mentioned, the bad things, and we're going to record an episode on Thursday night, lessons learned. And it's like we each have our top 4 things we need to do better. And that's just kind of how you you have your fun, but get back on it. Because I like the idea of learning from our mistakes better than, keeping content with what we did right type stuff. There's a lot to be said about that. So for you, how do you go about like looking back? Because I know like one thing I've referenced a few times, I love what Jenny Butler said on the FTN pod with Vlad about she keeps a diary now of her weekly fab. So she can go back and look at like in week 6, this is why I did it, at least in her head. This is the process. And because fab, like we will talk about, is just a wild process. So how do you go back and look at whatever it was you did wrong in your head? How do you go back and looking at that and then trying to correct it without giving away all your secrets?
Yeah. And I think I actually plan to go in more detail than I did last year. And this year I'm working with a partner, Jason Perkins. We've had a very successful year. We partner in a few leagues just to get to know each other. I think we'll expand that relationship down the road. And we'll talk later, I think, in the episode about working with a partner and the advantages I see with that and how it can be very helpful. So, and I think we want to work together of breaking it down by, okay, start with the draft or even pre-draft. What was our process? Where do we think we could refine? Where do we think we could do better? What worked for us? And then when you look at the draft yourself, so I'm going to look at a draft board. I'm going to look at the other teams in the top 10. I'm going to compare what they did versus what I did. I'm going to look back at, and we at some point, I think we'll probably dive into the draft and the teams. Like what picks were good? What picks were bad? Were they bad picks because of bad process, or were they just unlucky? Right? You're not going to hit 30 for 30 on the pick. So, where did I go right or wrong with my thinking there? And then in season, what was working, what wasn't in terms of fab? I think that's a really an unexplored area, more or less. It's like really diving into your fab. Where were you overbidding? Where were you underbidding? Were you winning a lot of your targets? Were you not winning a lot of your targets? How you can just get better at fab. And then, I think that's probably how I'm going to dive into it. I've made plenty of mistakes, and there's plenty of things for, lineup decisions also. I think it's worth taking the couple of days to go through it, because it'll help you now when your memory is fresh to go through those things. So then when you come to March or February and you're drafting, and then in the season, you have your notes that you wrote down of, hey, I did this right, I did this wrong. I made sure I wanted to change this for next year. So that's a little bit about.
I love the comment you made there that even for someone successful like you were this season, we always did stuff wrong. So let's go figure it out. Like that's just the truth of it all. Like when you lose, you think you just did everything wrong and nothing right, when in reality you probably did more right than you think. That's kind of where I'm trying to get with this. Like even in a great year, there's always stuff to get better on. So that's like the Kobe mentality when it all comes down to it. It's like there's always something to improve on. Let's talk about the draft before I keep asking questions and we just skip through the whole outline here. I'll try to keep us online for a second here, but I was going through your draft, and first off, you had the eighth pick in your draft. was that a target of yours? Where were you trying to KDS in this? Because I know a lot of people map out like their X amount of rounds. How did you pick the 8th KDS?
Yeah. So I definitely do map out rounds. I map out probably the first 12 or 13 so where I have different targets. And then after that, I've just got a list of names and I'm just going through it. And as they get drafted, I'm crossing them off. But I do want to see what's available, what I think I can get later in the draft that influences maybe some earlier decisions. In terms of KDS, I went into it wanting a top 6 pick. Because I saw 6 players more or less that I felt pretty confident about, at least later, and really Kyle Tucker was Kyle Tucker. I thought was a perfect player in the first round, very low risk. We could talk about process, but I used a combination of projections, SGP plus Ron Chandler's Babs, and Kyle Tucker had 0 risk, and the projections liked him. Babs liked him. He's 30-30. If Dusty Baker ever moved him up in the lineup, he would score, have better counting stats. But he was just a very high floor, high ceiling player. I don't play a lot of leagues. In total, I only have five fab leagues in the NFBC, 3 online championships, and then 2 satellite leagues, which I use as kind of warm-ups to get used to the player pool. I play 1 gladiator. So, I like those high floor, high ceiling players. And so that was really my KDS selection. So I ended up 8th. And the more I looked into it and the more that I read it, just thought about Ohtani, I became more comfortable with taking him there. And I had a pretty good idea when I had the 8th pick that he would be available at that spot. And I just thought he rated well again in projections and Babs, and he just had a higher floor than I would have thought. And again, the ceiling for him is out of this world.
Yeah. And I'm glad you went to Ohtani, because that was my question. Is I know it's a glaring hole of mine. I always just have a hard time when it comes to Ohtani in the draft, because I'm like, in my head, I'm just too like caveman-y. It's like, okay, well, it's either this or this. And how do you utilize, X and Y? And did you prefer him as a pitcher, a hitter? Like, where did you see him when you were drafting him?
Yeah.
Obviously, he's a unicorn. That's what Shohei is. And it allows you roster flexibility in your draft. That's another beautiful thing about it. But when you were looking at him in the 8th spot, you said you started to like loosen up to the idea of taking him 8th. You liked it. What was it? Was it the hitter? Was it the pitcher? Was it the flexibility? Like, what was it that stood out to you as Shohei on the 8th pick?
I think it was the hitter for me. I think is the combination that he would hit for a pretty good average. He hits home runs, and he does steal a fair amount of bases. Last year I struggled with, and we'll see this as the draft goes on, because we'll get to my 4th round pick, which really hammers us home. Last year I struggled with power. I struggled accumulating home runs, and I looked back at what I did wrong, why I struggled with home runs, and I just didn't have the guy that could hit the home run regardless of the ball environment and the run scoring environment. And coming into this year, we didn't know what the ball was going to be like. We didn't know if home runs would be up, if they would be down, sideways, left or right. And so I wanted to get a couple guys that they can hit home runs regardless of the run scoring environment. And Ohtani fit that bill for me. Sure. And so you get that combination of, hits a lot of home runs, hits for a decent average. He runs a fair amount, and the pitching is bonus. And I really only used him as a pitcher a handful of times when he had a 2-start week. I think the first start of the year where it was only a 3, a shortened schedule, but I almost predominantly used him as a hitter. And at the point where I would have used him as a pitcher later in the year, if I lost a lot of pitchers to injury, he got hurt as a pitcher, so I couldn't even use him as a pitcher. So I thought of him almost exclusively as a hitter, with just a pitcher sprinkled in when it was advantageous to use him at there.
Yeah, that's probably where I would lean. I'd think hitter first, because I just figure he's rarely ever going to 2-start, so it's hard to really utilize it outside of certain weeks, obviously, when your roster dictates it. But I'm with you in that regard. And then you went Betts, which is obviously a smash. We love that. You went McClanahan, who got hurt, which we'll mention. We'll get to that, back to that. But I wanted to hit on what you highlighted. You got Matt Olson in round 4, and what you mentioned about the power thing. That was one of my main goals in drafts this year. Like I have a ton of Pete Alonsos and stuff like that. So I'm like, I'm just getting power early. I'm going to figure the rest out. Most leagues it worked out well, not all, because you draft the smart people. That's the beautiful thing we're in here. But Matt Olson in the 4th round is like you literally have Betts and Olson. You have like probably 2 of the top 3 or 4 MVP candidates in the National League. That's pretty good for a winning team. But and then you got Ohtani steals, Betts steals a bit, not a ton.
Yeah.
So when you left those first 4 rounds, you had 3 hitters, and that's what I wanted to highlight there. Besides the power with Olson, you have 3 hitters, so you didn't go pitcher heavy yet. We will get to where you go next. But how did you feel with that base? Because it's like you got steals, maybe not as much as you can get from other guys in the first 3 rounds, but you got a ton of power. So I'm guessing you felt confident in getting steals later.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I mapped out my rounds, there were pockets where there was pitchers I liked, and I thought I would have a decent options as pitchers, and just the way that the ADP was working, or where you could get certain players, I just liked the hitters up top a little bit, and then I knew I could fill in with guys that I saw as above average and ace level starting pitchers in the next few rounds. And in terms of attacking stolen bases later, there was a really good article by Steve Weimer, the FTN Draft Guide, about counting stats that you can accumulate throughout the draft. And the way that I looked at stolen bases, I think this is one of the main reasons I had the success that I had this year, is that I think I was able to exploit the rule changes pretty well. So I didn't know the number of stolen bases that were going to increase. There was Jeff Zimmerman threw out numbers in the process. Jason Collette had an article on RotoWire about the stolen base increase. We knew it was going to increase, and we knew it was probably pretty substantially. But I don't think anybody thought it was going to go as high as it did. I think 40%.
Yeah. So
I knew that stolen bases were going to increase. And so when they increase, they're a little less valuable because you expect there to be more stolen bases. So you need more stolen bases to compete, yes, but you can find them all over the draft because more guys should be stealing bases. And by that measure, we didn't know what was going to happen with home runs, but by supply and demand, that makes home runs a little less valuable. And so I wanted to secure my power base and, again, get those guys that can hit home runs regardless of the ball environment, so I don't fall short on home runs. And then I think looking at the draft board and some guys I like, that yes, I could find the stolen bases later, and you'll see that with some of the guys I drafted. And then we can talk about Fab, how I really attacked that category in Fab.
Yeah, I love that approach. Like I wanted to get power, but I've already one of my lessons learned inside track for tonight's show is I had too many stolen bases. Like it's something we talk. Like I was running away with the thing. So I think I went too heavy at times where I could have adjusted and went maybe a more power, like a 35 home run outfielder that doesn't steal a ton, or just like different things throughout the draft. That's something I have to become better at. So that's why I really like the way you started. Like Betts is an elite player that doesn't steal a ton. So that's what kind of got him forced into their second round, where in reality, should he have been a second rounder? Probably not. Like, let's just think about it. So it's little things like that pan out. But let's hit on your next few picks here. You went Gausman, Darvish, and then Felix Bautista. So on paper, obviously everyone's healthy. You had McClanahan, Gausman, Darvish, and then your first closer is one of the best closers in baseball before he gets hurt. So you literally left the first 7 rounds with 3 outstanding hitters, potentially 3 aces, and the top closer in baseball. How were you feeling by that time that was all said and done? I know that's a pretty lazy question, but just looking at that board with the 8th pick, that's a pretty solid start to things.
I felt solid. I felt like I was executing my plan, and I felt like I really hit my groove this year in terms of my draft process, my actual draft setup, in terms of what views I had. So I felt coming out of those rounds that I was staying balanced. Phil Dussault has talked about pods. Give yourself options. Don't back yourself into a corner where you have to take a pitcher or you have to you want whatever the board is giving, whatever the other 11 teams are giving you. So I felt I was balanced. I had my good power base. I had some stolen bases. I knew Betts wasn't going to run that much. It was helpful about projections. I wasn't counting on him to steal even 20 bases. So like 10 bases is great from Mookie Betts. I was only counting on him for 14 or so. So I have my ace pitchers. I got a secure closer that I knew would get, pending health. I knew it was saves. This was also when Bautista, I drafted this team, I think in mid-March. Bautista had
injury concerns.
The injury, but he had started to throw again. Mm-hmm. So I felt a little comfortable buying that dip a little bit, that it seemed a little bit more precautionary. He was throwing. They were just kind of playing slow with him. So I got a little bit of a dip on Bautista, and I was very happy with that. So I was feeling great after the first 7 rounds. Yeah.
I enjoyed the Bautista that time of draft season as well. That was a beautiful thing. I was very, very happy about. But you mentioned something there. We'll come back to your actual draft here in a second. You talked about projections and your draft process and everything, and we don't need all your secrets, but like, what projections do you use? I know you mentioned SGP and some other things. There's like I said, I recorded with Toby forever. Dude loves his SGP, loves his projections. He's got his whole thing like in the processes deal. He's got it. Everyone's got their way to do it. So what were you using for your draft prep that made you kind of locked in on this process?
Sure, absolutely. So I do use SGP. I use a combination of the various projections on Fangraphs, obviously the BAT X, ATC, Zips also. I bring in Rudy Gamble's Razzball projections, which are steamer based. I like Rudy's version because he tweaks some things by hand. Playing time is a big part of projections. If you use projections, you know that playing time can drive up or down value. So I like that Rudy is pretty hands-on with that and gives me more confidence in those playing time projections. And so that's what I use from a projection standpoint. I also try to, if possible, like a projection system that's maybe more done by hand. So I used to use Mike Porthauser's pod projections because he did those all by hand, and it's a little bit of a different process. So you get some different results, and he identifies some players to have better skills or better projections than some of the automated projection systems. But Mike unfortunately stopped doing the projections this year, so I had to pivot a little bit. And then a couple years ago, I started using Ron Chandler's Babs in coordination with SGP. So I use them together. And I came about this because projections are not perfect. I admit that. I think anybody who has a fair sense of projections understands that there's holes in them, and there's things that they're good at, but there's things that they're not good at. And Ron Chandler developed this system that looks at a player's assets and liabilities and also brings in risk factors and looks at players more on a skill set, and basically says that, hey, a 40 home run hitter could hit 50 home runs or 30 home runs, and that's all within a reasonable projection. But we want to know, do they have the skill to hit those home runs? Or do they have the actual underlying metrics that support them being able to hit home runs? And by using those in combination, I'm able to identify draft targets based on, wisdom of the crowds. I like bringing in different opinions. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I read a lot of articles. I'm always trying to ask, trying to learn, and you're trying to see different players that pop pro and con. And so you're trying to identify players that bubble up from taking in a lot of these different opinions, wisdom of the crowds, and finding the players that you want to target, and then also finding the players that are maybe being overvalued in the draft room, and those are guys to avoid. So that's a little bit about my process and how I go about pulling together players.
No, I like that a lot because the point of kind of, I'm a big fan, and I know I have a lot of friends that podcast, and they're like, I don't want to listen to any other shows because I don't want to be influenced and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I actually like listening to other shows because I like to know what everyone wants to talk about. Like, that's what your listeners are. I learn things by listening to other people. I think you can get better by listening to other people. That's kind of how the world works in my mind. So you're saying, going and taking in as much information basically as you can, I think is a good thing. I know a lot of people, though, that like, even when it comes to just draft process, they want like these 3 things, and that's all I want to see, and that's what I'm living with. And hey, whatever works for you. That's why I like asking pretty much everybody how you go about things, which is very, very intriguing to me. Let's get back to your draft here. Dominated the first 7 rounds. You go Adames, Tyler O'Neill, mixed bags there. You got one of my favorite catchers in the world. And for those keeping track at home, Razzball Player Rater catcher number 1, William Contreras. So I just got to throw that out there. I love that pick. And you went Muncy, Happ. You went hitter heavy after you got Bautista. Literally 2, 4, 5, 6, 8 straight bats. Was this a part of your game plan, or is it more like, hey, this is what the draft's given me? Here we go. I like the pitching later. How are you approaching that? Because you don't see that very often.
I think, only to correct you, I think only 5 straight hitters, because I think then in round 13 I went Pablo Lopez and Montgomery. So I had the pocket of 5 hitters. Again, trying to stay balanced. I know I had drafted before that 4 out of 5 picks being pitchers, and so it was back to the balance, back to accumulating some more stats, just guys that I like to be productive hitters. Again, hitters that bubbled up for me between the SGP and Babs. It was kind of pockets where like there was a few catchers that I liked, and William Contreras happened to fall in this one. It wasn't. I don't know that I was like, I have to draft William Contreras, but he was the one who fell. It was a good process. It ended up working out great. He had even a better year than I could have ever imagined. Yeah, the playing time, he played, I think, a lot more than anybody.
That's why I loved him. I was like, he's going to DH or play first base or catch almost every day. Yeah. It's beautiful.
And I liked Max Muncy. Also, I thought he had some multi-positional eligibility, second and third. I knew the batting average was not going to be great, but he was playing off an injury last year, and he was completely healthy. And again, he's a good hitter. He's a power hitter, and in that lineup, he has the ability to drive in runs and score a lot of runs. And again, just trying to fill out at this point, I had drafted 2 outfielders. I had a first baseman. I had a third baseman. And I had a shortstop. I had 3 starting pitchers. I had a closer. I guess with Happ, I had 3 outfielders. So again, balance, right? I'm taking what the rest of the room is giving me, where I don't feel like I'm pressed into a corner that I have to pick a certain position.
Yeah, I love the balance here, because even like we talk middle rounds a lot. Like rounds 10 through 20 was Contreras, Muncy, Happ. But then you go get Pablo Lopez and Jordan Montgomery. Lopez literally is an SP1 that you got him at pick 152. He's probably he might be a top 60, 70 pick next season pretty confidently, I think. Jordan Montgomery's awesome. Thyra was great till he got hurt. John Gray had his moments. And then even Witt. Baez gets interesting. Haniger gets hurt, but not much you can do at that point in the draft. Like, those are good picks at that point. You really dominated a lot of this middle of the round, I think, which gave you the balance you're talking about. When you get past round 20 now, like you're going Eovaldi, Luis Urias, not Urias, Estevez, Savali, Whitlock, Diaz, Maeda, and others. Those last 10-ish picks where you kind of already have your balance set, like you mentioned, you got definitely your main core sitting there. How are you attacking those final 10 picks? Are you going for like the gusto? Are you trying to keep it really balanced with solid floors? How do you attack the later rounds in this draft?
Sure, absolutely. And just to touch your point, when you talk about speed later, when I mapped out, these were some of the guys that you had mentioned that I thought would be productive for stolen bases. So I like Thairo Estrada a lot. I know you're a Giants fan, that he was one of the few guys they weren't going to platoon. He was going to hit high in the lineup. He had all the ability to run, and he did run. We know stolen bases is just as much about speed as it is the desire to run. I liked Whit Merrifield also. I actually think I remember asking Toby what his thoughts were, you and Toby on the pod back in the offseason. And I liked Merrifield. I thought he was going to play a fair amount in the Blue Jays lineup. And again, he's a guy who has run the past, and I thought with the new rules, he's got a pretty good chance to keep running. So that's how I planned out that I thought I could get some stolen bases. I thought I could also get stolen bases from Javier Baez. He was a bust. I could not wait to cut him. But in terms of the last 10 rounds, my view for the online championship is when you construct a roster, and this applies to any league of this size where you're drafting around 360 players, there are options on the waiver wire. And when you get to these last 10 rounds, I look at it that this is your opportunity, the last even maybe 12 rounds, this is your opportunity to take risk. This is where you want the guys who, if they are healthy and they perform, they're going to be all year roster staples. They're going to be the guys that really out earn their draft cost. And if they're not, I want guys, if they're not going to be stars and be amazing, then I want the guys who are going to get hurt or the guys who are going to suck. And the reason I want, if it's that dichotomy, is because you're looking for guys to cut early in the season.
Easy cuts.
Right. There are guys that talented players who are not drafted, who the first 2 months of the season, it's a rush on the waiver wire every Sunday to pick up those difference makers. So you need cuts. Like it's hard sometimes I think it's harder than adding players in online championships. It's harder to figure out guys to cut. So I wanted easy cuts. So I didn't care if a guy, obviously I hoped all these guys would become stars, but if they didn't become stars, I wanted to know that they were bad and that I could get rid of them easily. And so that was my approach with these last 10 rounds. I did not want the Andrew Benintendi's of the world, because Andrew Benintendi, if he's projected for 13 home runs and 13 stolen bases, that's 26. There's 26 weeks. I picked this as 26 fantasy weeks, so it's 26. So that's a home run or a stolen base every week. So if Andrew Benintendi hits a home run in 1 week, you got what the projections are saying, and then the next week he steals a base, he's on projection. Like, how do you know if he's going to be good or bad? Like, that's what he's projected for. And I don't want those guys who are, they're safe just because they're playing. I think you can stream better than that using the Razzball tools,
100%.
Your own research. You can find more impactful players. So this is your chance to take the risk and find the Nathan Eovaldi, who was amazing for me. We could talk about later when we talk about like best draft picks or whatever. Nathan Eovaldi's stats on my team were unbelievable. Yandy Diaz, I thought was a great bargain, just because for what he was projected to do was very valuable. He hits leadoff. He hits for an amazing average. He was a big target because I knew batting average is, kind of fluky. Depends on BABIP luck or whatnot. Pete Alonso, terrible BABIP this year, drove down his, one of the worst BABIPs ever, drove down his batting average. So it kind of ebbs or flows, but I knew I had a guy like Max Muncy, maybe not the best average. Yandy Diaz was like, he's going to hit for, a really good average. That's what he does. He's going to score runs. I didn't even care if he wasn't going to hit home runs. That's not what I needed him for. I needed him for what he was going to do, which is score runs and hit for a high average. So he was a definitely clear target. Esteves, also, I was on, again, you try to take stabs at some different closers. They may not all work out, but you're trying to hit on a guy that I thought could be the closer. There wasn't a lot of competition on the Angels. Jason Collette had a good article on RotoWire about him being one of his, top closer targets, a guy who could emerge. And, that was also a hard lesson I had learned with Esteves. A few years in 2021, my first OC, I've talked about this before, but I got caught in the San Diego closers situation. I had drafted Mark Melancon and I drafted Emilio Pagan, and the fab before the season, I had the A's closer who I'm forgetting. I'm forgetting his name.
Liam Hendricks?
No, before Liam Hendricks. He ended up getting hurt. He had thoracic outlet syndrome before the season. Trevor Rosenthal. So I go into the fab before the season starts, and I'm like, okay, Trevor Rosenthal, closer, he'll be great. Okay, I've got Emilio Pagan and Mark Melancon, and that was when the San Diego beat writer was like, oh, it's Emilio Pagan's job. I think he's going to get the first shot. Great. Drop Mark Melancon before the season.
Yep, been there before.
To try to stream some bats. Mark Melancon ended up saving 36 games, and then it came out during the season that the Padres basically handed Mark Melancon the job before the season. So it didn't matter if he didn't have a good spring training, if they weren't concerned. And Carlos Estevez, I saw similar things happening. And I looked at the situation. There wasn't a lot of competition for him. They had come out. He was struggling in spring training, but Phil Nevin had said, it's like, we're having him work on throwing high fastballs. Like, we're not really concerned about his spring training performance. And so I never let that deter me. And I learned from previous mistakes. Again, it's a theme of, hey, learn from, it's okay to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. I drafted a lot of guys who sucked. Tyler Neer was terrible. Javier Baez was terrible. It's okay to make mistakes. No one is going to have a perfect draft or perfect fab or perfect line decisions, but learn from it so you don't try to repeat and make the same mistakes multiple times. And so I was steadfast that I thought Estevez could be productive. I wasn't going to drop him, and I held on to him. I didn't let the Jose Quijada thing. It was never really an issue to me, but I was like, this is Estevez's job. I think he's got it, and he was so productive for me. So that's a little bit about how I treat those last 10 to 12 rounds.
I like that. I like that a lot because that's one thing I'm always trying to figure out. I know there are too, because we hear the terms like churn and burn. You got to have a couple of roster spots. I think just the fact, like your Andrew Benintendi example is just so true that I don't think a lot of us think about when you just think, okay, he's steady, he's consistent, we can plug him in, we're going to get it. That plug it in is consistency, though, is not going to help you win. That's the difference, and that's what's very, very interesting there, especially unless he like all of a sudden finds the stride, which who knows. A couple things just looking at your draft as a whole. You basically had two closers, unless you want to count Fulmer as a third potentially, and then your very last pick was your catcher 2 in Trevino. Is that a strategy of yours, is to just kind of wait on the second catcher? And because I'm a fan, I always say there's tons of catchers on the waiver wire. I got no problem with that at all. But is the catcher and then the closing situation, was that kind of your goal going into it? Get like at that time, I guess 1.5 with Estevez, or at least 2 pretty good guys, and going from there?
Sure. So with the catcher, so I love reading The Process, Tanner Bell, Jeff Zimmerman. It's a great book. I highly recommend everyone read it. It's one of the more invaluable resources. I try to reread it every year. I highly recommend. One of the things they talk about in the book is that there's an opportunity with the second catcher to stream it, and that there's always catchers that become available on the waiver wire, and you can stream guys for a week. You can pick up guys who are more impactful for longer periods of time. And that's the way I treat the second catcher position, is that I dropped Trevino right away. I picked up Christian Bethancourt for a month plus. He was great. The Rays had a terrible, very easy schedule, faced terrible pitching. So Bethancourt was awesome. Then I kind of streamed some guys. I unfortunately missed Yanir Diaz. It was a miss of my part. I had Travis d'Arnaud and Yanir Diaz available in the same week. And this was when Sean Murphy had a hamstring injury. And I was like, oh, maybe he's going to be out. Hamstrings, who knows? He could be out for a month. d'Arnaud playing 60% of the time in that Braves lineup. I was like, oh, he just, in the case that Murphy is out and ended up not working out, obviously Yanir Diaz had a prolific second half, despite Dusty Baker refusing to play him. And so, but then a little bit later, last couple of months, I streamed Yan Gomes in and out. And part of the reason I was able to overcome Max Muncy's 200 batting average on my team, and Willie Adames, I think, had like a 214 batting average on my team, is my second catchers combined hit 270 this year. I had done the math. And Yan Gomes, I think, on my team hit 280 or 290 for the couple hundred at bats. And that is just, that's awesome to not have a second catcher sink like that. So that's how I treat the catcher position.
I like it.
And then at least a catcher 2. And also I'll add, there's plenty of ways to win. Any way to win, any system where you pick the right players, you can win. You could, if you picked Felix Bautista in the second, earlier than I picked him, if he's your first relief pitcher off the board, everyone thought you were crazy, but you would have been right. So there's so many different ways to win. This is just my way of thinking and the way that I look at for the 12 team leagues. Obviously 15 team leagues, only leagues, points leagues, the strategy may differ. So I always like to call that out, because there's so many smart people out there. There's so many ways of thinking. This happens to be mine. And in terms of relief pitching, I like to listen to people that are smarter than me, people that have had success in this format. And the guilds, Andrew Geller, I remember him talking about last year that he likes to attack maybe that second tier of closers and really do the work on trying to find closers. I think everyone, it's like, I don't want to pay for closers in Fab, or I want the security of just a closer in the first few rounds. But there are saves available. And obviously this year is unprecedented, but there are guys do get saves. And I really took that away from him, that put the extra work into trying to sort out the closer situations. And because it's the one position that's not just based on skill. The manager has to use the guy in the ninth inning.
It's true.
And the team has to win games to put the closer in position to have a save. So it requires more work and more time to identify those situations. And that was something I changed. I spent a lot more time looking at closers and dissecting the closer situation and my closer strategy of how I wanted to attack it. And obviously, I never thought Bautista would have this amazing of a year. I don't think anybody did. He struck out 100 batters.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was insane.
So, and I mean, it takes things like this that vault you from winning a league to winning an overall. You hit 100% outcomes on a few guys. Mookie Betts, most RBIs ever from a leadoff position. Matt Olson broke, 56 home runs, ridiculous stats. Broke the Brave, most home runs by a Brave. Felix Bautista, 100 strikeouts, a ridiculous number of saves. It takes guys hitting their 100% outcome that vaults you into the overall conversation. So that's kind of how I had attacked those two different positions, and it worked out well for me.
And one thing about the catchers thing is, if you want to stream catchers, they're always cheap, which is very nice. So you're not breaking the bank if you're trying to get the next big prospect that's going to cost you triple digits. More often than not, you can get a catcher for $1. I'm pretty sure you could get Young Gomes for $1 every time you try to add him. A couple guys might go for $3 or $4, but you're not breaking banks for catchers, which is great. So that leads me to Fab. Let's talk Fab. And this is the thing I joke about every Monday or Tuesday when I record my Fab recap, that you have the main events kind of structured, and it makes kind of sense when you look at it. And, most bids are within a realm of each other. Not in the OCs. It's anywhere from like $500 to $1. It's the craziest thing, league dependent, you can ever see on the face of the planet. And if anybody has a formula to figure it out, you're a millionaire by now. So, because it's insane. So we'll start with just the basics of it. You play 12s. You prefer the OC. How do you approach Fab, knowing the craziness here and the frustration we all have when we overspend by so much? But then, sometimes my solace is, 12 other leagues, I wouldn't even have won the person. But it's there's so many times, and even when you're having years like you had to have bids where you overbid by a ton. You're like, what just happened? It makes no sense. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you were very efficient this year. But how do you go about that Fab process?
So it's good to bring this up. I love Fab. I love it's an uncommon thing. I think a lot of people have frustrations with online championship Fab. I love it. It's the opportunity to make your team better. You only get one draft. You get 26 weeks, 26 times to make your team better. And I enjoy the puzzle of it. I enjoy figuring out the bids. I enjoy trying to figure out who to drop. Like I talked about, sometimes I think it's harder to figure out who to drop from your team than who to add.
100%.
And I enjoy that puzzle. I look at Fab. I know you talk about the Wild West. I look at Fab no different than ADP and drafts. When you look at ADP, it says one thing, but when you look at the 200 plus online championship drafts, there's always going to be guys who go higher than ADP and guys who go lower, and that's just the variance. So I think when you and something I try to do for my leagues, and part of the reason I also only play I only have a few teams in the NFBC is because I want to look at the league tendencies in Fab. I want to see archetypes of bids and what are streaming hitters going for? What are streaming pitchers going for? What are the prospects going for in this league where I can really hone in and try to eliminate that overspend, those overbids? Because you only have $1,000 of Fab in the NFBC leagues. There's no $0 bids. You have to be conscientious with your bids, because if you start bidding $50, $100 on every player, you run out of Fab really quickly. And so you have to, have tight purse strings at times and really spend the time, in my opinion, of learning the ins and outs of your league and how they're treating Fab. And I think using that approach has helped me rein in my spending. So Rob McCabe on Twitter, he's been doing a lot of Fab within the NFBC. I've connected with him a bunch. We've messaged back and forth on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. On Twitter, and he's doing a lot of great work. He's doing a lot of great work with Fab and trying to figure out where, as a community, we can get better at Fab. He's well worth a follow on Twitter. Rob is a great guy, and so he ran the numbers for me. So I was actually 58% efficient with this online championship team. And the overall efficiency was 52%. So I was above average, and I had to be efficient because my league, I had Rob was very kind. He ran these numbers for me. So thank you, Rob. My league was 12th out of the 205, 206 leagues. My league was the 12th most efficient league. And every week I would look at the bids, and they would all be within $1 here, $5 here. Guys would go for 100. The backup bid would be 95. So I had to be efficient, and the way to be efficient is to try not to overbid. And the way to not overbid is to really understand the value of the guys that you're bidding on. And in the online championships, there are difference makers, and then there are streamers. And there are only so many difference makers. There are only so many guys in the 12-team formats, in my opinion, that should be on your roster the whole season. And there's a lot of guys that you can stream in and off your team, and because there's comparable talent. And so maybe there's a guy on the waiver wire, he's going to Coors, or he's going to Great American Ballpark, or he's a lefty and he faces 6 righties. That's a guy to add. And vice versa. You have a guy, he's going to some bad ballpark, or there's going to be bad weather, or he's a lefty and he faces 4 righties, or they only have 5 games this week. And by using projections, and I know there's a question about what did you do differently versus last year, is I really started to also run my projections in season. And by doing the SGP in season, I was able to identify players that are these difference makers and players that are streamers. And that helps with the cut decision. It's okay, the projections don't really see this guy as a guy that I should keep on my roster all year, so I'm okay cutting him, versus maybe in years past, it would have been a guy that's I have to hold on to this guy. He's too valuable. And that's how the projections kind of eliminate some of those bias and help you identify guys you can cut who they're not season long, they're on a hot streak. You ride the hot streak, you drop them, versus, the projections, there's a guy in free agency, he's a surefire starter in a 12-team format. That's a guy I need to be aggressive on. And those are the guys that you push for higher bids on. And I think that's, if you can look at that approach, it helps you realize that a lot of guys you can lower bids on, and it's okay if you don't win them, because you have your waterfall and you'll win a guy similar. I'm always comfortable with that I have a lot of options. So if I don't win my top target, there's a good chance that there's a guy in my second, third, fourth conditional that I'm pretty much just as happy with winning.
I think that's one of my biggest couple of things you mentioned there. I need to do a more diligent job of paying attention to what the rest of the league's doing. That's one thing. I try to, but not nearly as much. Like you mentioned, I know Curlin does it a ton. I'll be in chats with him, and he's mentioning 6 guys. I'm like, wow, you really sat there and analyzed it all. And that's how he does his bids, to kind of fine tune it all. a lot. So that's definitely an angle that I need to be more diligent at. The other thing is I need to be more just like you said, okay with, okay, I didn't get the top guy. Okay, so be it. Like, it's not the end of the world. Like, I think that's part of the problem why overbidding happens a lot is you're like, I have to get this guy. And like, no matter what, I have to get, like, later in the year, if you have a bunch of fab left over, okay, go get your guy. Like, you got the fab money, but especially early in the season where you're trying to save it, like you mentioned, especially early in the season when there should be even more options available on the wire. Be okay with option like C or D, even. Like, just be cool with getting this guy down here, saving that money for later. I think that's a very, very great point that I think I need to become better at accepting. Just, you don't have to get the best guy every time. That's just the way it works, because most of these guys are streamers anyways. Like you said, they're not going to be game changers. So why am I worried about overspending for a guy I'm probably going to drop in a week or two anyways? So what's the big deal?
Right. And the how I'll also spin losing bids. If you think about it this way, the NFBC shows the backup bid for all players who were in. So you can't see what, if you weren't the backup bid, you can't see where you landed. But early in the season, I try to see how many backup bids I was. And the way that I spin it is like, yeah, I lost a player, but I beat 10 other guys. I beat 10 other bids or players' thoughts. So if I win early enough season, if I'm the backup bid enough times, I know I'm going to start winning my top targets. Now, obviously, I don't want to lose my top targets every week, so there's some adjustment. But I'll give a great example. Jaron Duran, when he first got called up, he went for $92. Yeah. My bid was $6. My bid was the backup bid.
That's
so I knew, and we could talk about some of my key ads. Like, okay, so yeah, this one guy maybe just thought Jaron Duran was a difference maker. We have different valuations. Like, that's okay. I would have won him if I was only in a league of 11 and this guy was out, because I had a better bid than 10 other teams. And by looking at that helps you hone in on how the league is valuing players, and helps you, again, figure out maybe guys that you can bid less on, or, maybe there's, you bid 6 and the backup bid was 7. It's like, oh, okay, like I'm off, and that helps you adjust.
I think that's an amazing point. That's where the fab world, it's like, we all sit there and find what people we want to add, and then you start putting numbers to it, but there's so much depth to it that the best of the best go to find the differences. And some of it's just something like really not even that complicated. Spend a couple extra minutes and go, hey, here's how it really broke down. I was runner up to this guy, so that's big. Or the runner up bid was, even if say you bid $3, the runner up was $5. Like, okay, I was close. Like, we're in the ballpark. Like, there's something there to a take home message, especially as the season goes on. A couple more fab questions, and we'll get into actually acquisitions and drops that you had this year or whatever. When you're doing fab, like, some guys try to budget it out, and it's not always easy, obviously, based on this year being insane with prospects and all kinds of other things. Did you at least have like a target of how much you wanted left to finish the season? Because I still had money at the end, but not nearly as much as I wish I had at the end, if that makes sense. Like, I had like a couple bucks where even $10 would have been a tremendous difference. Did you have a plan in place, or just kind of it's where the cookies crumbled?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, talking about the theme of mistakes you made last year, learning from them, getting better. Last year, like I mentioned, I finished third in a couple of both OCs. And the last week position to win, I had that Davis Martin, and I didn't have fab left. And so I got my 8th conditional. I got stuck with him. He blew up, and I was so mad. And I learned, and I said, okay, I have to keep fab around for the end of the season. And you need that ability to go the extra dollar on a couple guys, especially if you have injuries or there's just a better streamer. So you need that money to save. And also, if you're the top team, second, maybe even third, the way the NFBC fab works, if you're tied on a fab bid, which you could be late in the season when everybody's bidding $1 or $2, you lose on a tiebreaker to a lower placed team. So naturally, if you're in first or second, you have to bid more than $1, because you lose all dollar bids if anybody else bids on them. So really, a $2 bid is like a $1 bid for a first place team. So you need that ability to save money. So yeah, I went in, and Jason went with Jason. Was like, okay, we're going to start out with, we're going to hold $100 in September. And I did fluctuate. My partner Jason Perkins and I were playing our first year. We had an OC together. We ended up winning Ellie De La Cruz by $1. I think 334 to 333. And we had budgeted out, okay, if we win Ellie De La Cruz, how much are we left with? Are we comfortable with this? But instead of holding $100 for September, we lowered our September budget to 25. So you can be flexible, but you do want to, based on league tendencies, obviously online championships, sometimes more leagues are active than others. Sometimes you have teams that drop off, so you are less competitive bids. At the end, some leagues it's not. My league that I won the overall championship, the league made its most moves the last week in August that they had made since June. So it was extremely active league. So I needed to save a little bit more money because the bids were still competitive to the very end. I wasn't winning guys $1 unopposed, $2 unopposed. I was bidding, still $7, $8, $10 to win. To win guys because I knew that the league was active. So I do try to budget out money for September, and I do try to stay with that. It is a moving target because different needs come up, different players come up. You have to fill in gaps, or there's guys that just are difference makers that you need to dip into that September budget. But it is important to plan it out and to try to stick to it best as possible because it will help you at the end.
Yeah, that was a big takeaway this year. Like I did what I wanted to have fab at the end, but I needed like more than $4 or whatever. Like I needed to be able to get those guys instead of, like you said, like your 8th pick. I needed to get like the 1st or 2nd pick. Like those are the difference makers from cashing or not cashing, as silly as that might sound. Last thing I will mention before we go over your ads and drops. You mentioned you did a handful of OCs, a couple satellites. How many is too many fab leagues for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think I'm at my max quite yet, but I think this is the pro of bringing in a partner. One of the pros of bringing in a partner is, and the reason I sought out a partner coming into this year, and Jason's been great, I really enjoy working with him, is that when you bring in a partner that allows you to play in more fab leagues because you have somebody to carry the load, someone to bounce ideas off of, someone, we all have life things. We have weddings, we have kids events, birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, just things that come up. And so to have a partner to say, hey, you can't miss a week of fab, you can't miss lineup decisions, but sometimes you're just not always available for the full amount of time. You can have a partner help out. So I would say in terms of fab leagues, I would say I have room for a couple more. I was in 5 this year. I may have to talk with Jason about what we want to do in terms of satellites versus OCs. I would say a couple more is my max.
Yeah,
because I just don't have the room at that point or the time to do all the details that I want to, looking at leagues, tracking things. I don't want to. And honestly, that's something I was looking at the online championship, is that there seems to be that sweet spot of if you only have one online championship, the average ranking I think was around like 1,300, 1,330 or so. And then teams that, I'm pulling it up. So teams that only had one online championship this year, their average ranking was 1,330th. And there was about 700 teams that did that, of 2,460. Then if you take the average ranking of people who had 2 to 5 online championships, that average ranking was 1,177. And that kind of makes sense. I think the reason to try to do more than one is you balance out some injury luck. Doesn't matter how conservative you are of a drafter, injuries will find you, fluke hit by pitches, just things out of the blue, just fluke injuries that even the healthiest guys are prone to. And also fab, every league is different, right? Some leagues are, maybe they're every week, they're just outbidding you by $1. Doesn't matter how much research you're putting in, they're just on top of every pitcher, or they're just hoarding every pitcher. You need pitching, you just can never find it. And so by having a few different leagues, you're trying to balance out those luck factors that you'll find one league that just everything just works perfectly.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's interesting, so 2 to 5 finished 1,177th. People who had 6 through 9 online championships, their average ranking 1,178, basically the same as
about the
2 to
same as 2
5.
through 5. Yeah.
And then people with 10 or more, 1,210. Or sorry.
So a lot of diversification is what you're coming down to.
Yeah, so like it's a sweet spot. So try to play more than one, but it seems like you don't have to play more than 5 because it's just diminishing returns. So
that's why I upped it to 3 this year. I kind of like to spread it out a little bit, but not too much. And
exactly.
It kind of like I got in every draft I drafted one early March, mid March, late March, and each team got better and better as draft season. And that could have been a fluke.
I did the same. No, I did the same. I spread the drafts out, and I think that's a solid approach. Again, it's a way to diversify if there's injury news or prospect news.
As ADP shifts, it's just the way it goes. Like your drafts will change. I mean, you might want the same targets, but it's going to completely change as, like you said, news and everything comes out. It becomes crazy. And you mentioned prospects, so let's really get into Fab now because this is where it gets fun. You already mentioned you got LED and the Crews in the league, but let's talk about this league here. Some of your top Fab moves of the year. You have one of the best potential prospects you picked up here in Matt McLean. You got some other guys. So let's talk about your 3 best hitter pickups you had, and why did you think, like, the fact you got Ha-Seong Kim in June for $18, that is called game changer stuff. Like he's just what he was able to provide at the leadoff spot in San Diego was insane. I wish I believed in Matt McLean as much as others people did because that was obviously great. But how did the Kim, McLean, even Jake McCarthy you have on the list? How'd that all go for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of what I do in the season is I track. I started doing this year. I heard John Posma talk about it on the Pull Hitter podcast with Rob D, tracking the 80th percentile. And I thought that makes a lot of sense because it allows just to see how your team is doing and where there's room for improvement. So early in the season, I lost. Some guys weren't performing. Tyler O'Neill, I was counting on for steals, not doing well. Javier Baez was terrible. And I looked at my projections for my team, and I knew I was short on stolen bases. And part of that was intentional. Part of that was I knew the stolen base environment was going to be unpredictable. So I thought maybe there was opportunity to find these guys later in drafts and also on the waiver wire because we didn't really know who was going to steal more. And by looking at the 80th percentile, I identified very early that stolen bases were in need. And I didn't wait till the All-Star break. I didn't wait till whenever to work on this issue. I attacked it early. And I had some misses. I picked up guys like Bryce Terang or Tyrone Taylor early in the year, guys who didn't pan out, just trying to find somebody who was going to hit. And Taylor Walt's guys, they were bad. And then I was able to land on Ha-Seong Kim. Again, he fit the profile. He looked like he was stealing. He was starting to play better. At that point, he was only hitting leadoff, I think, against lefties, but it was a good lineup, and he was running. And I used some knowledge and from league tendencies that this league particularly didn't really seem to be, for the most part, overvaluing, bidding heavily on these stolen base guys. And so, I think I won him 18-16, very efficient bid. And obviously it was a huge game changer. He took off for most of the second half and he was unbelievable. And same thing, I added Jake McCarthy, the same thing. Vlad Sedler had a tweet that he was down in AAA and he was performing well. And sure enough, I thought I could get him for $1. He got called up before that week's Fab, so I had to bid 16 on him. Again, I won pretty efficient. And again, it was players that those were guys that I knew they were more helpful for my team. So I was a little bit more aggressive with my bid. And obviously part of it is luck, right? I could have caught the one guy who loved Jake McCarthy and he got it for $80. He went, I think, for close to that in one of my other OCs. So part of that is definitely a little bit of luck that just no one else saw the same thing I did. And then Matt McLean also, I used projections and I saw that projections really liked him. He was a difference maker. And so I was pretty aggressive with him. 55 was one of my higher wins, for the whole year. And this really paid off for me for stolen bases. So in week 7, I'm looking at it. I was 43rd. Actually, I was 43rd percentile, and I actually dropped in week 9 to 33 percentile. And I know this because I picked up Jake McCarthy on that the ninth that ninth week because he stole like 7 bases, and I jumped up to 53rd percentile in stole bases. And over the course of the season, I made up a ton of ground and stolen bases because I attacked it early, and I finished the season at the 87th percentile, 86.9. And I think that's due because I didn't wait to attack it. I recognized it was a weakness. I knew it wasn't going to get better with the guys out on my team, and so I needed to find ways to improve and improve quickly. And those guys were great for me. They did exactly what I needed.
Phenomenal. That's so basically what I'm taking away from a lot of that is, and this goes back to your draft. We talked about getting Olsen and company. Get the power early, get speed off the wire. It doesn't always work that way, but in the atmosphere that we were going to live in potentially this year, seemed like a definite way to go. On the pitching side of things, now this is where 12 teams get a lot more fun compared to 15s. Grayson Rodriguez, Tanner Scott, obviously there's a save source late, and even Brian Bayo. Like I saw this, and I'm like, Brian Bayo was on the waiver wire in your league? Like what? Like that's a fun one. I kind of get it because he started the year hurt and then he came back late, but what went through on those 3 pickups?
Yeah. So Grayson Rodriguez, again, he was just doing really well in AAA, and I saw that. And the Orioles didn't have the deepest rotation, so at some point he was going to get called back up, and he was performing well at AAA. So I thought he was a worthy stash. Bayo, again, it was just trying to build pitching depth, and this was early in the season. I picked up him and Bailey Ober. I saw them as just as good, if not better, than all these pitching prospects that were getting called up, and they came a lot cheaper. Mm-hmm. And again, it was like the Red Sox seemed at that point they're going to keep him in the rotation. People had liked him coming into the season as a guy to grow, and he kind of was just kind of under the radar. And again, he came for a lot less than a lot, a lot of these. All these pitching prospects that got called up. And so I just wanted to continue to build that depth. And then I put Tanner Scott on here because, I clearly to win an overall, you have to have some luck. And you have to, I'll never shy away from it. It's skill, but there's also luck, right? Guys hitting their 100th percentile. And where I got unlucky is I got unlucky in terms of, I suffered a lot of injuries in a short amount of time. So between the All-Star break and September 1st, I lost 4 of my top 7 picks. I lost Ohtani, both starting as a pitcher and then as a hitter. I lost McClanahan. I lost Felix Bautista. I lost Yu Darvish. I lost Steven Matz. I lost Matt McClain. I lost Evaldi. And so a lot of my depth got wiped away very quickly. I was losing those guys, bing, 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 like every week. I was like, every day, how could I keep losing these guys? And Bautista, especially when it happened, was at a point where I knew I needed the only places where there was really big movement in the standings in the overall competition was wins and saves. And I knew I needed to just keep bolstering those stats. And so I was like, okay, I've got Felix Bautista. He's going to keep getting good ratios and saves so I can add other closers. And then, of course, he gets hurt. And I was like, oh, great. I just lost my key source of saves all year. And that happened to be the same week that Tanner Scott got named the closer on Sunday night. And I was like, I have to have it. And I put in it was probably the most nervous I've been for a bid because Yennier Cano was actually taken. He wasn't available. So there's one less option to bid on. And I won him 16-4. And he was, I think he saved my season. He had 9 saves from me for basically a month. And that would have been, I could not have found that anywhere else. Yennier Cano got nowhere near that. It was actually lucky, again, a little bit lucky he wasn't available.
Yeah, so he wasn't nearly as good as people thought he'd be, for sure.
So, I mean, I was lucky in terms of I didn't suffer my injuries until later of the year, and then I got a deluge of them. But Tanner Scott was just like I said, he was a season saver for me with the stats he had for the last month. It was great. And you wouldn't think a guy you add for just a month could have that much of a difference, but he did.
He did. He definitely did. And that just goes to show you how you couldn't really find saves that often on the wire. So when you could find one, that was even a bigger deal. And you answered a question I had written down is how did you survive like losing Shohei and Bautista and stuff? So that's a good point you had there about just working it and working it. And luckily also it came up like at the end of the year more than anything. So you kind of had something going on. Before we go into your like what happened fab moves, basically, you mentioned watching the overall standings. When did you start watching the overall standings?
It's a great question. So I started watching the overall standings in about mid-June, I'll say. And I knew this team was a contender because around that time, my team had what I perceived as like not a good week. And at that point, I think in the time they were maybe in the mid-teens of the overalls. And they didn't really fall. Maybe I fall 10 spots or so in the overall standings. And sometimes what you see in the overall standings, if you have one bad week, your team could plummet just from 12th. My online championship with Jason, we reached a high of, I think, 12th overall. And then in a few weeks, our whole team went cold and we plummeted. And we were in 12th overall in mid-August. And we fell into the late 100s. And so things can move very quickly. And when I saw that my team didn't really drop that much, it's like, this team is a contender. And then from that, after that week, they went on they didn't have a bad week until September. I would get home runs, stolen bases, win saves. So that's really when I knew. And for the most part, at that point, for most of the season thereon, I didn't really have to worry about the league standings. I had, just a pretty good lead where I could really focus on the overall and figure out where my team was weak overall versus in the league.
Perfect. And that'll kind of bring me, you mentioned Bayo as rotational depth early. When you're looking at the overall so much, and we've talked a ton about, streaming and this and that, where do you start making even a more important impact? And maybe like, do you look a couple weeks ahead? Do you do anything like look at the overall saying, I can gain points here. Let's look like 2 weeks down the road here and start rostering guys. Do you do any of that kind of stuff, or do you stick week to week and you just look at like filling positional needs? Like, I guess that's a weird way of saying how do you did your fab approach change when you started seeing how the overall started taking place?
I think in terms of, I think I wanted. I don't think it changed too much. I think I wanted to week by week, right? Just take it week by week, trying to get the best stats. And I was cognizant of where I was weak or where I thought I was fallible, and making sure that I didn't let weaknesses. Oh, hey, my guys will turn it around. Just are they really going to turn it around? Like, are my guys, my pitchers still good? Are my, not getting content with just the guys on your team, right? I think one of the reasons I think I won is I never thought my team was good enough to win. I never looked at it as like, I got this. My team's gonna cruise. I was like, this team can't win the overall championship. I've got to get better. I've got to keep making moves. I never just laid down. I made a deal with myself that you can never, no matter how hard I work or how much time it is, there are so many things out of my control, and somebody could just make better moves than me, and somebody could just have a better team, and there's nothing that I could do about that. I can't control who they added, who the teams around me added, who they put in their lineups. I can only control my team. So by that means I cannot control if I win or lose. But I said the one thing I will promise myself is I'm going to give it everything I've got to try to win. And I'm never going to get content with the team I've had. I'm always going to try to find ways to make it better. And yeah, maybe I'll make mistakes. Maybe I'll drop the wrong guy. But I'm going to give it everything I've got and not leave a what if I had added this guy, what if I dropped. I'm going to really go for it. And that's why I approached it all season long with Fab. It was like, how can I make my team better? Where are the little advantages? How can I just get a little bit better here or there?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Just basically grind it all the way to the end is what it comes down to. Never be content until that checkered flag starts waving. So I'm with you there. Let's talk about some of the moves that you're like, why did I do this? Basically, um, you got Winans for $26. Yeah, I guess at the moment I could see where Winans was at least somewhat interesting because the Braves and prospects and all that kind of good stuff. And then you had Taylor Walls. We already know that discussion. You said you got him over Jaron Duran. So that's another one as well, which makes things quite interesting. And then you did even what I did. I did this in a ton of leagues, is where you've dropped Tyler O'Neill. Let's go add Tyler O'Neill again. That's always fun because, like, hey, he's healthy again. Let's do this. It came at the expense of CJ Abrams. And then the Tariq Scuba one, yeah, I sadly did the same. So going back and looking at that, how are your thoughts on the ones that didn't go so well?
Yeah. So I like to bring this up because I make mistakes, and I think it's important to understand that you can win an overall and still make plenty of mistakes. We could do a whole nother podcast of draft mistakes, bad mistakes, lineup decision mistakes. It's okay. You're not going to be perfect. It's about trying to get more than you get right and try to learn from the mistakes. The Winans move, I think I should have watched him, that he doesn't really didn't have that great of stuff. And it was after he had beat the Mets. He was lined up for a 2-start. I had just lost a bunch of pitchers, so I definitely overbid, and it's like, it's a good matchup. It's a good team. I needed, I didn't want to fall behind on wins. Playing for the Braves, good chance to win. So that's the way I thought about it. But it was he just wasn't as talented, despite his underlying metrics being pretty good. He just, it was just an overbid from that standpoint. Taylor Walls, again, is just like not talented. And Jaron Duran, I should have seen. He went for $1, and I just missed. He had a good week that week. He was supposed to face 6 righties as a lefty, and it should have been an easy stream for a team that needed stolen bases. And for that cheap of cost, that was a miss. Tyler O'Neill, I drafted him. The projections love him, so that's like, oh, if the Cardinals are going to play him, he's finally healthy again, and he just complete bust. One of my worst draft picks. And I think a lot of people, if they had known that Ali Marmol was going to do all this stuff, would have never drafted him. But I think we know that for the future because Ali Marmol is back. And then Tariq Skubal I'm mad at myself because I had the winning bid, and I was going to bid in the mid 40s. He went for 42. And I don't know why at the last second I pulled my bid down. Like, I maybe read some things that he maybe wasn't as good as he suggested. But the projections liked him a lot. And I was mad at myself. And then, of course, I saw him just roll off an unbelievable last couple of months. That was just I had the winning bid, and I brought it down too much, and it cost myself a win at him. And so that was just a miss.
Yeah, Scuba was a tough one. I'm with you there because I was so torn on him. Didn't get him anywhere. And that's when looking back would have been pretty nice. Let's just talk about some of the other fantasy discussions here, because we've talked about, the power, the speed, and all this kind of stuff. Looking ahead to 2024 now, like you've already mentioned how you were more focused on power in this draft, and you already talked about your best waiver wire ass pretty much getting speed. Is that kind of a similar approach, you think, to 2024? Because I don't see how the steals market changes a ton. Like, obviously it'll fluctuate, but if the rules are what they're going to be, I don't see it changing a ton. And that's kind of how I think it's going to approach. How do you see 2024 and speed taking place?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the difference versus this year versus 2024 is this past year, we didn't know the impact of the rules. We didn't know who was going to steal more. There was guesses, but we didn't know. Now we know the impact of the rules, and we know that it's going to be the fast guys who have the speed and get on base and have the will and want to run, and they're just going to run wild. And I think the question will be, there were a lot of those guys that came off of free agency, in my opinion, in 2023. And I think the thing for me and for everyone to figure out is if we're going to be better at drafting those guys in 2024, or if they're going to still get you're going to be able to pick up guys off the waiver wire who are impactful stolen base guys. So I think that's something that I'm planning to dive into. I'm going to see how the market, the early draft market is treating steals and some of these steals guys, and try to figure out if I agree or disagree with how the ADP is shaking out in terms of that. But I think it's a good question, and clearly we're going to need more steals. We're going to need more steals to compete. I have the 80th percentile, so I can tell you what that is. The 80th percentile for steals in the online championship this year was 198, 200 steals. So that comes out to 14 per 14 hitters. And obviously you have a couple catchers who may not steal. So we're going to need more stolen bases than ever. Interestingly enough, you needed 23 home runs per roster spot. There was 322 to hit the 80th percentile. So you still need that combination. And there's going to be a lot of different approaches to get there. There's the extremes. There's the Asturi Ruizes who don't do anything else except steal. But he was getting platooned late in the year. There's obviously those power only hitters. So I think you may see more extreme roster builds just because it's hard to get to those stolen base totals 10 or 15 at a time. I'm not sure if that's something I'm going to do, but it's something I will look into. But it'll be interesting. What do you think?
I'm in line with you. I think it's going to be, we know what it's going to be now. You need the guys that are going to steal a lot. We were like pure speculation going into last season. Like we had our ideas, but I don't think anybody had the perfect formula for the most part. You had some guys pretty darn close, but it's like I said, I had too many steals. I was winning or top 3 in like every league in steals pretty much. And so I need to find a way to still get my steals, but kind of rein it in and worry about other stats. And that's where it'll get fun. Like I've already done that too early DC with Rob and all them. And I got I had the first pick, so I got Acuna. That's obviously nice. But I paired him with Lindor, so that's another steals guy. And then I think I can't remember who my other hitter was, but I got like 20 plus steals out of each guy potentially. So it allows me kind of room to fluctuate as the draft goes on, where I don't need to pepper it as much. Because for me, I was always aiming for let's get guys that steal me 10 to 15 bases almost at all times.
Yeah.
And after a while, that's why I said I need to go. Maybe Jorge Soler would be good for my team later. Like that's probably a player I should look at compared to let's go get another one of these guys type thing.
I think it made the point that you were like, I had too many stolen bases. I think that was really easy to do this year because no one knew Acuna was going to steal 70 plus bases or Corbin Carroll. So if you had both of those guys on your team, that was like basically all the stolen bases you needed. Yeah. So if you even had a few other guys who stole 15 or 20, it put you over. So again, I think that knowledge, people will have this knowledge now. And so I think, like you said, you're going to see more of a, diversification of where guys are attacking stolen bases and you don't need not that you can draft Acuna and Carroll together on the team anyway, but you don't need both of those guys.
Exactly.
You're just going to be too inflated in steals.
Yeah, and it gives you, I think, more flexibility throughout the draft, knowing that there will be more guys later that can still pick you up maybe 20 plus steals than there used to be, and so that's pretty nice as well. On the flip side, the pitching side of things, this was a wild year for pitching. Like we don't really know exactly what kind of ball we had for a while there. It was pretty wild, but then no sticky stuff and all this other good stuff, but. We all said it going into the season, and your draft kind of showcased how you had like 3 kind of aces for the most part early on. There was some like elite talent really early, and then there's kind of like a glob of guys you knew could be ones, but also could fall. And it was just like this weird section of the draft. And I don't see that changing a lot, really. There's still just like a handful of like guys you really, really trust. And there's a ton of other things, let alone innings pitched are down because guys are always getting hurt now. It's like, if you can get 150 innings out of a lot of guys, that's outstanding these days. So how do you think that market's going to change for 2024?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the NFBC teams, a lot of drafters are creatures of habit. So I think we're going to still see the pitching get pushed up as we get closer to the beginning of the year. It happens every year, regardless of the environment. And I think to your point, it's having options, about being able to put yourself in a position where if guys have bad matchups, you have other avenues that you don't have to use guys in those bad matchups when they face the Braves or they face the Rangers or their at Coors Field. Of course, the Rockies stunk, so at Coors wasn't as bad as it was in the past. But giving yourself options where you're not backed into a corner. Like we've talked about a lot of it is about flexibility from the draft, from FAB, giving yourself options. And I think starting pitching is the prime example of that. Give yourself options. Give yourself the ability to play the guys with 2 starts, with the good matchups. I think that'll always be a key.
I didn't really ask you it when we recapped your draft because you said in the last 10 picks you're taking your chances, guys you can easily drop, so on and so forth. But you did have like a Savali and some other guys there. Were you purposely trying to build depth guys, or how were you looking on draft day for starting pitching, I guess?
I think starting pitching is maybe a little bit different because, again, if you're trying to only use guys in their good – you're looking for skilled players, but, again, you're trying to maybe use guys in only their prime matchups. They're not every week starters for you. Hopefully you capture like an Evaldi, right? That's it. That's
but when you drafted them, you're right. You're hoping for like certain matchups. Yeah, 100%.
That's like 100% outcome. Yeah, his stats were ridiculous on my team. Savali, so that again was I think that was a Bloomberg special.
Yes,
I think
that was Ryan's guy.
Highlighted him a lot, and there was a few different things. He had changed his pitch mix, and obviously the Guardians are pretty good at pitching development. So I think with pitching, it's a little bit lower of a bar, right? You don't need the absolute high ceiling, high floor. You're just trying to find a guy that'll be usable and take some step forwards where you feel comfortable using him in those home starts, those above average matchups.
Something you mentioned right before that. How often? I should ask you this during the FAB, but we'll go real quick back to it.
Yeah.
How often on your FAB process are you trying to make a point to get 2-star guys over guys that'll make your team better per se?
I don't know if this will surprise you or not. I very rarely streamed at all on this team.
Based on your roster, I could see that, especially once you added a few guys to the depth. You're probably pretty good to go.
So again, part of it is I drafted a pretty good rotation from the start where I didn't have to. But again, it's about building that depth where you have the flexibility. So if there's a guy with a good 2-star matchup and you think it's a reasonable price, you can bid on him. But you're not reliant on streaming starting pitching.
So you weren't trying to break your bank for it, like some other people. Like it sounds like they pound the drum. You got to have 2 starts. You got to have 2 starts.
No, only towards the end where again I lost so many options. Right, I lost McClanahan, I lost Evaldi, I lost Ohtani, I lost Darvish, I lost Steven Matz, who was at that point a pretty big part of my team. So by that point, I did have to dip into the well because it just my depth got, even if I was trying to build it back up, I just kept getting decimated every week with it. So, I don't try to go extreme. It's like I don't have to have the 2-star pitchers, but it's not like I've never bid on a single one. It's finding that balance.
No, I think it's a good point to make though. Is you don't have to have the 2 starts. It's more about quality over quantity. And we hear so many times that you have to have innings, you have to have at bats, and to a point, I agree with a lot of that. But I think it's also with the changing landscape, especially on the pitching side, where I say like 150 innings is good, where compared to like 200 innings, you might take that quality over the quantity every time. And that's just kind of a mindset, again, something I'm trying to continue to remind myself week in and week out. With the save situation, you mentioned getting Tanner Scott. He was one of the big guys on the wire. Adbert Alzolay was probably the biggest one at one point earlier in the year. A couple other guys, but in general, was not a massive year for saves on the wire, as so many guys got 20-plus saves, 30-plus saves. Pretty much like a freak year when it comes to the way we've seen things in recent years. What's your guess? Because we have no clue on how this plays out this year.
Yeah, agreed. It's a crazy situation, unprecedented to see this stability. I was giving this some thought, and here's my thinking. And someone may come back after the show and say some things that make me change this thought. But this is the way that I look at it: that teams use more than one closer, or use their presumed high leverage reliever closer outside of the save situation in a few situations. One, when nobody is talented. The presumed closer is not talented. there's the rest of the bullpen is not talented, so it doesn't really matter who closes because there's no guy who's better than the rest. They're all about equal. The other situation that I see is that there's one talented player. I think it's like the Dodgers this year. You have Evan Phillips, but the rest of the bullpen is not that talented. Guys underperform, guys get hurt, and so the manager Dave Roberts feels like he has to use Evan Phillips earlier in the game because he can't get to the ninth inning to use Evan Phillips without using him earlier because he doesn't believe in his guys. MLB players are creatures of habit. I think these guys like the relievers. They like to know their roles. 100%. I think the managers don't want. I think most of them would say, if gun to their head, that they want to use one guy in the role, but because if your reliever knows he's coming in the seventh inning every game, it's like that. MLB players do the same thing every day. So coming in knowing what inning they're coming into is what they want. So I think what we saw this year is, again, this is anecdotal. This is just my own thoughts, is that the bullpens got better, just better stuff. Every guy's throwing 95 or 100, where I think the Twins are a good example. I think I saw you tweet about this. It's like the Twins bullpen outside of Duran was really good this year. And so Baldelli he didn't have to use Duran earlier before the ninth. He could save him for the ninth inning. And I think you're seeing that more across the league. This is how I've thought about it. Somebody could say bullpens were just as bad as ever. It just happens to be a year that, all the closers were so stable. I think the one thing, we didn't really see a lot of injuries in the season to closers. You saw
very, very true.
Edwin Diaz early and Bautista late and Alvarado late, but not, Alvarado got hurt, but he was kind of a co-closer. There weren't really a lot of those big in-season injuries. So I don't know. That's my thought. I think maybe the bullpens are getting better where the managers are confident of the guys before their closer, and they can just keep the guy we think is the closer as a closer. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you made some really, really great points there. I think I think most managers prefer just to have one guy. I think that it's a great point you make, that when a manager uses its quote-unquote closer in a different role, it's because they don't have other guys that should be pitching that inning. Like the Twins are a great example. Griffin Jackson's a beast. He can pitch late. They had a handful of guys that can go, so just allowed Johan Duran to pitch the ninth. Baldelli is a manager we've seen in years past use his best pitcher early in games, and he didn't have to this year because of the strength of the bullpen. So I think there's a lot to be said about that. I think it's also the point you made about teams making their bullpens better. And it goes back to the innings pitch thing. Is there's so many starters in every rotation now that outside of maybe one or two guys aren't going more than 5-6 innings. So you have to have a strong bullpen. You have to have a deep bullpen that allows you to do these things that you can trust in early inning roles and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot to what you're saying there that, again, it could change next year. We could be purely speculating on what happened in an insane season where all these guys got saves. But at the same time, it makes sense. I think teams are changing their philosophies because if the innings pitched from your starter aren't expected to go as deep as before, you need a deeper bullpen. You need a smart bullpen. So that makes sense. On the flip side of that, how do you think that affects relievers getting drafted this year? That's the fun part.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about it. It'll be interesting. I think
it's a pure guess.
Yeah.
So don't worry about it.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, because obviously you have this stability, right? And when you have this stability, one would think that means everybody should get pushed down, because if you think this stability, I think it depends if you think this stability will continue or if this was a fluke year. I think if you think this stability will continue, you could draft saves. You've drafted saves successfully throughout the whole draft, pretty much, outside of a couple of exceptions like Ryan Helsley. But pretty much a lot of other guys hit. So if you think that there's going to be that stability, you can maybe push your luck a little bit with the closers. Yep. If you think this year was a fluke and we're back to guys losing their job, guys getting pitched in the seventh, injuries, blow-ups left and right, managers changing who their closer is every few weeks, maybe you push the closers back up again. So I think there's not one right or wrong way to draft, any position, especially closers. So I think it'll kind of depend on your level level of comfortability as the Saves environment as a whole. I probably still not a fan of taking, at least in the 12-team leagues, of taking a guy in the first few rounds as a closer because, I won't get Matt Olson in the 4th round, but, Matt Olson in the 4th round got me 54 home runs, 127 runs, 139 RBIs, and he hit 283. Yep. Somebody drafted Emmanuel Clase this year, 2 picks before me. I think that person would like that pick over again if they had the choice. So I think there's just an opportunity cost there of, not saying Emmanuel Clase or whoever goes, maybe Haters back as the top closer because Bautista got hurt, they're certainly talented players, but it's an opportunity cost. If you need your home runs, you need your stolen bases, you need your pitching, something's got to give at some point. So
I agree with that. That's why it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to allow some people to take more chances. Now we'll see if those chances succeed. Will be the fun part in that mix. Rookie call-ups. This is going to be one that who knows, but an insane amount this year. I usually hate bidding on prospects because I hate overpaying for guys that more often than not didn't pay out. But you never know. McLean was great for you. Bybee was awesome for me. It worked out for certain times, not all times. So first off, how'd you handle that this year? And how do you think it's going to take place in 2024?
So it's probably an area game. It's probably one of the weaker areas of my game. I'm not really a prospect guy. Most of the time when these guys got called up, that was the first time I'd ever heard of them. So it's not a strong point of mine. It's something I need to get better at because I rely on the projections, and projections are not very good at projecting rookies. So it's something that I need to figure out in the off season of how to get better at. And one thing and this is where I won't pretend that I know everything and they're smarter people than me at this, is I want to hear what the prospect guys have to say on if this level of call-ups are sustainable, or if teams are realizing that it's not worth just wasting at bats and innings pitched for these guys in the minors, and they're just going to keep calling guys up earlier and earlier whenever they think they're ready. And if this level of talent is sustainable, do the teams have this level of prospect to get called up every year? I'm very interested to see what the very talented prospect guys in the industry have to say, because it's definitely a game changer. And a lot of fab dollars went to a lot of these young guys, and it'll be interesting to see if we get the same number of call-ups every week, right? It was a surprise this year, but next year, if we see the same thing, everyone has the approach, and maybe some people wish they had kept money for the Bobby Miller, call-up, or had more money for Ellie De La Cruz because he got called up later. We don't really know necessarily if all the best call-ups will happen earlier, so maybe you'll see, less aggressive spending earlier because we know a lot of call-ups are coming, so I have to save some of that fab money for an impact prospect later. So I'm very interested to learn, again, talk about things getting better at and learning, and there's always room for improvement. It's something I'm interested to learn about this year and to figure out how to get better at myself at it.
Yep, I'm with you. That's one of my top 4 things to talk about tonight's show. Anything, some other topics here real quick. You've mentioned a few times working with a partner, and this is one thing that I have been hesitant because I just know the way I operate. I like to live in my lane, but I'm willing to talk to people and have discussions and make myself better in that regard. But decision making, it's hard for me to share responsibility, and that's a fault of mine. I am very aware of. But you've mentioned a bunch of great points to this, so. Let's talk about the pros. You mentioned time commitment and stuff like that. What were the big benefits this year working with a partner?
So I think one of the big benefits of working with a partner, Jason Perkins. He's great. Our first year working together. He's a really excellent fantasy baseball player, and we share a lot of similar things, but also we do things a little differently, which is great. And I think that's one of the big pros of a partner is you get a different perspective, you get different opinions. Maybe there's something about a player, a draft, fab that you missed, and your partner picked up on it. Well, there's great. You found a different perspective. It's also good for helping lower your bias. It's a big tenet of the process that one of the reasons I use projections, I use BABS, is to try to get out of my own head and try to get out my projections, right? Mookie Betts, I didn't think he was going to steal 30 bases because the projections and Babs didn't think he had that skill set in it. So I wasn't thinking about something that was, counting on him for more stolen bases than was reasonable. And having a partner helps that too. Jason, at one point I was thinking late in August as like dropping Yandy Diaz. Like I was 100% in runs scored. I didn't really have room to make up for runs scored, and average, I probably overestimated or underestimated the level that average could still move. And I was talking about with Jason, like, you can't drop Yandy Diaz. Like, he's too talented based on the other, other guys. He's like, drop somebody else. I looked at a guy, I was like, yeah, Jason, you're right. So it helps, balance out, just balance it out and get a different perspective. And in addition to the time management, right? You have somebody else to help with lineup decisions, to bounce ideas off of, to do fab, to tag team if you have a couple of different teams, and to ask questions also, right? Jason and I both have our own leagues that we manage independently. So sometimes he'll ask me questions. I'll ask him questions. Who are you starting this guy? What do you think about this? I think I'm always looking for opinions and advice. I'm not afraid to ask for fab advice, for lineup help, because again, there's someone that an analyst may see. They may see an angle that I didn't see, and it's important to bring in those opinions. Like you don't get there's no bonus for doing it. Sure. You don't get extra money because you made every decision just on your own thinking. So
just for being stubborn.
Yeah. So, and you're going to be wrong. And there's going to be, sometimes it's like, oh, there was someone recommend a lab decision. And it's like, oh, I don't know about that, but it makes sense. And you bring in what other people think, plus Rudy's Streaminator things and some other rankings. Rotoballer's got rankings, Pitcher List has got rankings, RotoWire's got rankings. You kind of bring in different sources, and that helps kind of form. It's like, okay, like, what's the wisdom of the crowds thing? What's the most probable outcome here? So I think that's the big pros of a partner, big pros of asking for advice. I encourage, it's also good for, hey, take a look at my team. Maybe they see something about your team. I would ask people, it's like, in season, do you think, where do you see the holes in my team? Because I've been looking at the team every day for 4 or 5 months. I fall in love with guys, right? Maybe I'm blind to something. And I think it's good to get that outside perspective. It's like work. You want somebody else to check your work. You want somebody to give a second eyes on it, because when you're so involved in it, and you're so involved in the details and the minutiae, sometimes you lose a bigger picture, or you lose, just an area that you think you're stronger in, and somebody looks at it like, you're not that strong in stolen bases, or, I think you're pretty vulnerable in saves. And you're like, oh, that's a good point. So I think that's a big tenet for me is don't be afraid to, get opinions from a partner, from an analyst, utilize your partner, help your partner out also when he or she has questions, and really work as a team.
No, I love it. And I think that's something I need to do better of. Is I guess I get worried about like draft day and stuff like that, but the in season stuff, it could be invaluable. The way you talk about it could be a tremendous help. So I agree with that. You also mentioned setting up SMART goals, and that is an acronym, folks, SMART, that is heavily utilized. So what are you talking about when you say set SMART goals?
Sure. So like Bubba said, it's an acronym. It stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And I think it's important when you go into a season to figure out what you want to achieve that season. I did not come into this season thinking that that my goal was to win the overall championship. My goal coming into the season was I had 3 online championship teams. I was like, I want to win 2 out of the 3. I want one of those teams to compete for overall. And the reason I wanted 2 out of 3 is in the NFBC, if you win a certain number of contests, you get a badge on your profile. And if I won one a couple years ago, and if I won 2, I I would qualify for the badge. I wanted that silly badge.
Well, that's why I have a badge now. I was curious what that was from. Like all of a sudden it showed up.
I wanted that badge. So the goal, and then my other goal was like I wanted to do well enough to get invited on a podcast. And my fiance, who is great, and we got engaged in July on a Sunday, and I gave up Fab that night, and I proposed to her on a Sunday night in July, and she's amazing. And I think there's no better way to show commitment to somebody than when you're shooting for overall to give up a Sunday night to propose to somebody to show you truly love them. And Sam is the best. And when I would get through the middle of the season, Sam would, and my team would have a bad day or two. She would remind me, so what were your goals at the beginning of the season? Like, you're achieving those goals. Even if your team doesn't win the overall, you're doing what you set out to do initially. And as the season went on, my goals adapted. I realized my teams were winning, so I would move up my goal. Okay, I want to be first. I want to just touch first overall in the overall standings. Okay, I did that. Okay, move on. Set up a new goal. I want to be first overall by the end of Sunday. Get overall at the end of Sunday. NFBC sends out an email. They'll put out the winners. Sometimes you make a headline. So I wanted to be in that email by the end of Sunday. Did that. Then it was like, okay, get featured in a headline. Keep being a first headline of the email. Okay, I did that. Finally, I got to that, and it was like the middle of August. That's when my goal became to win the overall championship.
Win the whole thing, yeah.
And so I think that's important. And honestly, next year, I was reading the post that Greg put out. No team has won the online championship more than once. So I don't even know next year. I mean, what my goals will be, but it may not even be realistic, right? Yep. Talking about realistic goals, it may not even be realistic to say to win the overall championship again, because no one's ever done it before. So it's not like there's a precedent behind it. So I think you want to keep those smart goals in mind, and like I said, you can change them and you can grow your goals as they go on, but start with things that are you can measure success, that you think are attainable, that are realistic. And I think if you set your way up for success that way, then you're put yourself on a path to achieving those goals. And then you can look back, and if you didn't achieve them, okay, where did I come up short? How do I adjust for next year? And if you hit those goals, okay, how do I expand those goals and make them more challenging the following year?
I love it. That's like you said, the realistic, the R in smart is, I think, one of the biggest parts of that. Make sure they're realistic. Like, we can all set goals. We can all want to be astronauts and go to the moon. We can all do things like that, but let's just be realistic. And like, for me, this was like my first like heavy OC. Like, I think I did 1 or 2 last year. Like, I'm doing 3 this year. My goal is to compete. Like, I just want to compete. I want to show that I learned something, I competed. Obviously, like, ideal, I was like, I want to win 2 out of 3 or something, but I hadn't got there yet. I hadn't won the league yet. I want to compete and show I learned something from last year. Yeah. Got to this year. I got pretty darn close. I didn't finish it. That's what makes me mad. But it was like, okay, I made that step. So now my realistic goal next year, like, okay, let's win at least 1. Let's win 1 of the 3, and let's go that direct. Realistic goals, not like, hey, I want to win every league I'm in. Yeah. I want to finish. Like, that's like, come on, the baseball's crazy. It's 6 months. Injuries happen. Like, certain teams, you just have no chance. It's just the way it is. Like, one of my 3 OCs, the one I drafted in the beginning of March, I think, it finished 12th, and I busted my ass every week in Fab just to try to get out of 12th. And with every injury, it was impossible. There was just nothing I could do about it, and it was just the way it works. But
and that happens.
Yeah, it happens. But like, so that's why realistic goals are necessary to take place. So I love that part. I love the whole thing about it. Set up goals to succeed, and that's all parts of life, not just fantasy, but that'll help you everywhere you go. And congrats, you got a winner there for the fact she lets you do all this stuff, but for the fact that you gave up a Sunday night in July, and you didn't cheat. You didn't go like, hey, it's All-Star break, I'm going to go like, hey, it's a small Fab week. Like, we're going to go do this. So kudos to you. Let's hit a couple listener questions here, and then we'll wrap this one up here. It's been a good one indeed. Ben Tidd, good friend of the show, been on the show many times, good guy. And he fared well last year in the main event. He asks you, Drew, what pick and what waiver ad do you think helped you the most?
Sure. So I'll give you two picks, a hitter and pitcher. So Matt Olson, I cited his stats earlier. I give a little chuckle people are like, oh, you have to draft Matt Ellis. You can get his stats, later in the draft. It's like, good luck getting what Matt Olson did later in the draft.
283.
So he clearly was an unbelievable pick. He just was two players basically in one with the amount of stats he put up. So he was incredible. And then Nathan Eovaldi, I didn't get his full season. I did bench him at times early in the season. So I got 100 innings out of him on my starting lineup. He had 9 wins, a 2.86 ERA, and a 1.0 whip, and he had 95 strikeouts. And that is incredible for where I drafted him. Yep. And then in terms of the waiver wire, we talked about these guys. Of the guys we talked about, I'd probably say Ha-Seong Kim, just because the stats he put up on my team were really great. And I encourage people in the NFBC, or honestly even Yahoo also, is go look at your year-to-date, your accumulated stats, because if you just look at a player rater end of season values, guys who got hurt or guys who were sucked for part of the year but then were productive, they're not going to show up well on a player rater. True. But on your team, they were pretty very valuable. So I mean, Ha-Seong Kim was incredibly valuable. Also, he stole, I think, 27 bases on my team, and I'm trying to find him. Let's see. Yeah, he stole 27 bases, and he hit 268, and he was just awesome. Scored 56 runs. But like, Jake McCarthy is a great example, right? I only had Jake McCarthy for a couple months, and he was also valuable. I didn't absorb all the suckage that he was at the beginning of the year, and obviously he got sent down. So take a look at the stats that you actually accumulated for these guys. I think that's a big takeaway, and you may find that some guys were more valuable on your team than their full season numbers would suggest.
100%. Mike Curlin, he has a question for you. He says, what was the biggest addition to your 2023 prep that you credit for making the largest impact, and so you see a way to build off that to further improve?
Yeah. So great question, Mike. So I think one of the big things is every year I just get more comfortable with my draft tools, with the SGP, with BABS. Just again, every year you just learn little ins and outs of how they work and how to manipulate them and make them the most useful possible. So I think that's always a big thing for me. And then I think the big takeaway or big thing improvement was my in-season management. So this year I started tracking the 80th percentile. I started tracking FAB, and I think I can do that better next year, to track it a little bit more in depth, maybe by week. I would look at my SGPs in season. I ran them in season, which I hadn't done in the past. And I think that's where I really took the step forward, is that in-season management.
100%. It's one of the hardest things to do for 6 months. So if you can pull it off, that's a humongous win. Little Book of Calm, great listener to the show, great person. He has 2 questions. First question, what was the biggest change in your, I guess you just answered this, biggest change in your process and everything. Second question, what change do you want to make to your analysis for next year to help you go back to back?
Yeah, it's also a great question. And I talked about it briefly before, but my prospect knowledge and the rookie knowledge is not great. Part of that is just some of these guys are just not always valuable in 12-team formats, but there definitely are the guys that are valuable. And it's trying to get better at identifying and evaluating the rookies and prospects and figuring out which ones are 12-team viable and which ones I should be keeping on my radar and believing in, because they're the guys that the projections we talked about this, they're the ones that the projections get wrong the most, at the most uncertainty. They're going to have higher risk in BABS just because of lower experience levels, but there are exceptions and there are guys that do stand out. So I think that's where I want to get better at, because it does seem like potentially these big number of call-ups could be here to stay.
Yeah, I think it might be a new wave of the way things work for teams to save money these days. So we're going to see that more often. Yeah. So I think that's a thing. I wanted to shout out real quick. You mentioned Rob McCabe. We've talked about him a lot on the show before. On Twitter at SleeRat Nation, SLEEHRAT Nation. He's got a lot of good stuff, and he said he's got some deeper research he plans on bringing out here pretty soon. That'll be pretty cool. But awesome guy with cool fab stuff. But Drew, we're going to wrap it up there. This has been a great time talking to you. I'm going to have to go back and listen to it myself. And I don't listen to a lot of my shows a second time, but a wealth of information. Any final thoughts on an amazing 2023 season?
I would say that it's just been such an incredible season. I tried to make sure I enjoyed it the best way possible. It's just a fun game. I love everything about it. I'm so blessed to have the success that I had. I really appreciate all of the support that I've received from the community and so many people reaching out and sending me congratulations. And I'm very much appreciative of that. And I'm very much appreciative of all the amazing content providers out there. I would not be in this position without the great content of all the hard and all the people you're at the top of the list of people who work so hard to put out so much great content before the season, during the season, after the season. I would be nowhere without it. So I'm very thankful for that. And I always have to thank my family, thank my fiance, like you mentioned. They let me have those Sundays. They let me have those Sunday afternoons and those Sunday nights. They understand, and they've always been incredibly supportive. Just a lot of thanks. It's been an incredible season, and I could have never have dreamed it. So I'm very lucky to be in this position, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you having me on. I had a blast, and it's always great talking fantasy baseball. So excited to take a break, though, to be honest. I'm going to take a little bit of time off.
I don't blame you. Like, this is my version of a break. I'll just do a few podcasts a week, and I'll kind of lay off the writing for a week or two. That's as sad as it gets. That's my break, but that's just kind of this is what I love to do. So it's a kind of part of the deal. But congrats, man! Absolutely awesome stuff. Well deserved. I look forward to chatting with you again. I'm gonna have to have you on again, and we're just gonna talk actual 2024 season stuff. Like this was great talking strategy. Like everyone's got a different way to do it. Like, and I absolutely love hearing the angles and what works, what wants to be better, so on. It's been awesome. I even got a couple texts throughout the show that people were watching saying how good this was. So really awesome. Good stuff, my friend. And I look forward to chatting again sometime.
Thanks, Bubba. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Problem. Everybody, make sure you check him out on Twitter at @Fru_Dorte. That's Drew Forte, or otherwise known as the 2023 NFBC OC Overall Champion. This was Bench with Bubba, episode 608. Catch you all next time.